listening to Inclusive AF with Jackie Clayton and Katee Van Horn.
Welcome, welcome. This is the Inclusive AF podcast. My name is Katee Van Horn, and we are missing Jackie today. Jackie is otherwise occupied, so she's not able to join us, and I know she's super bummed about it because this one is going to be a great one. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Becky, just to introduce yourself, tell a little bit about who you are, all that good stuff.
I can do. Thank you so much for having me, Katee. It's fun to reconnect. So Katee and I know each other from Target Corp. So I was an operations leader. Katee was in HR, and so we interacted a lot. So it's fun to see our paths reconnect in this way when we're in two completely different spots now.
Yep.
So pretty fun. So my name is Becky Evan. My pronouns are she and her and they. I am an associate professor of management at Metropolitan State University, which is part of the Minnesota State College system. I've been in this role for 4 years full time. And so I've been in Minnesota now 17 years. I know I had to think when I'm like, oh my goodness, one, I can't believe I'm old enough to be anywhere 17 years. And two, I can't believe that I've been here 17 years. So I'm originally from Los Angeles. And growing up in California, especially in the time I grew up, I remember, for example, the LA riots. Race has been a really salient conversation that I've had, and how it showed up in my work has ebbed and flowed. I've worked in nonprofit organizations, and I have worked in corporate organizations. So I worked at Target, and then I worked at Cargill for 2 years in their human resources area. I'm married. My wife and I have been together for 20 years. We are parenting 2 boys together, Ben and Cole, 11 and 9. One is in middle school, which has just been awful. So yeah, and we black that part of our life out, right? I'm like, oh, buddy, I know this is hard, but I don't remember it because I blacked it out because it's hard. And
right.
So, yeah. And so I'm really excited to be here with you today. I know that some work by a research team that we interviewed white DEI professionals. And I know that's what we'll be talking about. So we'll be weaving in and out of both my personal experience, but also the research. And I'm happy to go in whatever direction this takes us.
Awesome. Perfect. So I would love to start off with just what brought you to this work. So, when last we were connected at Target, I know that you were leading a team, all of that type of stuff. And so what pulled you into this, other than obviously kind of, your life and, some of the experiences that you've had, but
yeah,
why this work?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I do think about it quite a bit. I think that in some way, I never remember being a kid that was able to be quiet. I vividly remember on my walk to school, walking by a Planned Parenthood and getting into fights with people who were protesting. And so I've always felt this really strong pull to speak out to when things don't seem right, or it seems like fairness is my language. And I think that as a kid, I can reflect back on that. It's interesting to juxtapose that, and that I grew up with a really racist white supremacist parental figure. And so I had this activist streak. I very much was speak out about any oppression that I saw, yet in my own house, there was very much explicit racism on a daily basis. And so that was a really interesting world to navigate. And I don't think I sorted that out until I got a little bit older and I came out. And so that was a whole other thing. So I came out in my 20s. I identify as a lesbian, and I grew up incredibly religious, and I'm part of a religion that doesn't support that. And so I think that all of these things surfaced and really confronted between my own identities and my own beliefs about humanity. And so I found myself gravitating towards anti-oppression work, like it's bigger than me. It's bigger than my own safety. It's bigger than my own comfort. It's really, humanity deserves better. You that and that I've always loved people, truly, genuinely love people. I think they're now one-on-one that can be really hard. But collectively, humanity to me is I love them. I think that the power that we have to make change and to do right by other people is vast. Um, and it's interesting again that I hold that belief and that I'm an incredible cynic. I don't know. So that makes for some fun work, right? Because we're all human. And so I started getting involved with ERGs, employee resource groups, when I was at Target. So I started out getting involved in the LGBT group, but then I started getting involved in the African American ERG, because racism is so apparent in the LGBT community. And I needed that for me to have that intersectionality work. Personally, and I know I've always shared some personal, but I think it's important for me to also mention that both of my boys joined our family through adoption and they're African American. And I think that I feel a real sense of accountability to them and actually an entire community to raise them for me to be race conscious and to work on my own stuff so my kids can grow up and be the beautiful Black men that they were meant to be. And that can be quite complicated. They're growing up in whiteness. And yeah, so so I know that was like kind of a lot of different paths, but it really brought me here. And then when I decided to get my doctorate, I did it in business. So I received some advice when I was getting my master's. Somebody said, no matter what you do, go into business. You'll always have a job. But I didn't want to research those types of topics. And so I researched senior executives that identified as lesbians. And I found a way to bring the things that I care about or that have meaning for me into business. And I think business is slowly catching up. I think that there's a lot of movement, a lot of academic movement. And so it's pretty cool to be in a space. I'm in a college of management. But I research diversity, equity, and inclusion topics. And so I feel really lucky a lot of times that I get to do what I do and that I get to work with like the coolest people on the planet.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think, it just in thinking about the path that you have been on and, the different experiences that I'm aware of, I think it is one of those things that, I always have told people Target was such a good training ground and such a good proving ground for so many different topics. And, obviously we can talk about kind of current events with Target and some of the, the recent stuff that has not been great, we'll say. But, and I think, you and I both have dear friends that still work there and, are doing the absolute best they can to represent and to, do all of the right things. But I would love to hear a little bit about this most current research that you have done. And obviously, I will preface it for folks that we will obviously share the link to the research so you can read it for yourself. But the research is really around white people doing DEI work. So this one is near and dear to my heart. So would love to hear a little bit about kind of what you did and what you found.
Wonderful. Yeah. And thanks for sharing the link. And I also offer up anybody who is not in a place where accessing this article is free to please connect with me directly. I'm able to share it that way since I know that it can get kind of expensive to access these academic articles. So the paper is called White DEI Professionals' Perception of Their Contribution to Advancing Workplace DEI. And we're really looking at, so what is this leveraging and decentering whiteness? There were 5 of us on the research team. Dr. Stephanie Sisko from the University of Minnesota and I were first authors, and then we partnered with Dr. Crystal Sarek-Fashant, Ms. Neela Nandial, and Dr. Stacy Robbins. And we're from 3 different institutions, different backgrounds, different degrees. and really came together to say, okay, how can we do some research in this environment that really begins to unpack whiteness in the workplace? And it's a really, I don't want to say tricky topic. That's not fair. I think many of us can identify what whiteness in the workplace is. Many of us can identify dominant culture in the workplace. I think, however, it gets complicated when we start using words like whiteness and anti-racism and white supremacy. And many of the organizations I know that I've worked in, even in nonprofits, believe wholeheartedly in meritocracy, work hard, get promoted. And we really wanted to unpack that a little bit. And so as this team was talking, and it was about a month after George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, we felt like it was one contribution in that moment of many that we could make to really getting to the root, like what can, and it's not even like how can we better understand this phenomenon of being white? But we wanted to see from people who are doing this work. So not like we can pick all the bad folks, quote unquote, right? Because there aren't good or bad, but bad, we'll use that word, those that are making lots of visible mistakes, white supremacists, etc. But we're like, what about these people who are being paid to do DEI? What's their story? How did they get there? What's their passion? What drives them? And so we met with 16 different individuals across the United States. They work at vastly different organizations, from Fortune 500 companies to government organizations and nonprofits, all different parts of the US, all different ages, and all of them identified as white, and really asked them, okay, so tell us your story. How did you get involved in DEI? What's it like being white in DEI? What are the benefits? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? What was your onboarding like? What was training like? And came up with a really rich conversation. I feel like it was so hard to end those interviews. I'm like, I want to keep talking to you, because I think that there is such a richness to individual stories. In the end, we took all of this information we got, and we found 4 broad areas and ways that people engaged. So we really tried to look at, like, how can we distill all of these stories? And we found that there were 4 key ways that individuals engaged in DEI work. The first one is as a leader. And I don't mean this by title, but I think that they all saw themselves and have had others refer to them as the DEI experts within their organization. Some of them did not want that. Some of them were okay having that. But they really saw this role of being a leader as having the responsibility and accountability of educating white colleagues and leaders, that they saw that there was this leadership element to their work. We also heard folks, and we called it a beneficiary. How did individuals approach DEI work through the agency of whiteness? So what was the advantage of being white in DEI? What walls did this break down? What tables were you at that perhaps other people have a tougher time getting to? And was it effective? So that's up for debate. Is it more effective for me, Becky, to talk to CEO of said company who's also white, when neither one of us have that lived experience? And I think there is this initial lower defense. I think that we're all familiar with the term white fragility and how that manifests itself in different spaces. And also the people we interviewed talked about that. The next one was an interesting one, because not all people like this word, and it was ally. And it's not that they liked it, it's just that they didn't quite Some of them really embraced being an ally, and some of them just did not like this term ally. Yet they all worked at corporations that had ally training. And so it is a word that's being used in companies, but individuals themselves felt very uneasy about that word. How we defined it was, we looked at it two ways. We looked at this language choice of being an ally. We also really asked, like, okay, so you're on a DEI team. Talk to us about anti-racism. What language do you use in the workplace and out of the workplace around racism versus maybe broader terms like diversity, inclusion? And so we really dug into that. And I think a lot of folks really spoke to Dr. Kendi's work around ally not being a fixed term, this idea that I can be a racist one minute and an anti-racist the next minute, and that can switch throughout the day. And it's a target that I am working towards. And then the very last one, we played with the word forever, and Dr. Cisco and I talked about this forever, but we went with Pathfinder. We realized that folks really were, there's, for all of us, a lot of tensions and complexities to the work. And how did individuals navigate that? And in many ways, they had to all learn how to hold these tensions. With individuals in their workplace, with leaders in their workplace, with ERGs in their workplace, and also not really having any training to do this. And so that's really, I know that was a long summary, but that was really a summary of this work. And the stories that people told were really powerful and inspiring. And honestly, it makes me think, like, okay, so how can we do this work better, differently? How can we do this work in a way that minimizes harm? Can we train white people to do this work truly? Like, is that a training we can offer that could be effective? And I don't think we have answers for those today, but I know that that's what we were keeping top of mind as we were interviewing folks.
I don't know about you, but I don't know very many people that are hopeful about the world of work. And I'd like to change that. My name's Marcus Mossberger, and I started the Hope at Work podcast, where you'll find two things. Number one, really interesting guests. And number two, innovative ideas about the future of work. Check it out.
So when you think about those four kind of personas or whatever you want to call them, is there did you determine that one was better than another, or that there was a stack rank, or there was a progression of, oh, you start as this and then you move to next, or how, what was the logic there?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I don't necessarily think that we found one was better, or that there's even necessarily a rank. But that these were all working together in tandem. And it was really founded into, like, we tried to situate this in kind of identity development. And we looked at it, how am I doing this in my in-group identity, and how am I doing this as an out-group identity, and what is my in-group identity, and what does that look like? And I think one thing that we did see is some of these behaviors were intentional, some were happenstance, and some were forced upon an individual based on their circumstance. And that all of them evolved in time. Their views evolved, their understanding of the work evolved in time. And so I think that's also, like, I compared to, like, Tamo Kuhn's ladder of inference, right, which is this really, like, clear path moving up. We did not see that in this particular research, but somebody did reference Okuhn's research, put that out there. So yeah, right, there's a lot of these intersections and weaving in this work.
Yeah, it's interesting because, what you just said, I think resonates so much with me personally doing this work, that I think we all, anyone who's doing this work can talk about the mistakes that you've made as you've been learning, as you've been growing. And Jackie and I both talk about the fact that neither of us are experts, because there's just a constant evolution going on of how this work shows up every single day in every single different scenario, and who is in the room. And I always, think about the fact that, I've made so many mistakes in my career and doing this work, but it is you still get up in the morning, you still try. And I don't know if you're familiar with Aubrey Blanche. She's at Lajda now. She's at Culture Amp. She did a ton of work around just DEI, like the exhaustion that comes with doing this work, but then layer on top of it some of the ongoing trauma that people of color, that people in marginalized groups, et cetera, have to deal with. Like, I talk about the fact that I can take off my work hat and this, who I am when I go out to get groceries or to, whatever it might, it is I might be doing, whereas other folks cannot. And so there is yes, you're going to make a ton of mistakes, or you're going to make mistakes. I shouldn't say a ton of mistakes, but you're going to make mistakes, but it's also, what is the impact that you're having? And the one that, and, I think back to this earlier in my career where I was very much all about equity. Oh, we just need to treat everyone the same. And, to your point, like fairness was it still is a very, important thing to me. And, and so it was always like that equity piece and thinking about that versus equality. And again, how my brain has changed and how I think about, some of the HR processes that I was a part of throughout my earlier career. And we were looking for folks to fit a certain mold, to have, that type A driver personality, to have this, to have that. And there wasn't a lot of room for different, or for someone that did not fit the mold. And I think we had some, especially at Target, had some great folks who were, I'm thinking, Caroline Wenga, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I cannot remember her name, the woman that was in charge of ESG. And anyways, it doesn't matter. Yep. But some of these folks that they were outside the mold and they made it work, but it was very much this is an exception. Mm-hmm. And I think that's been in so many of the places that I've worked. It's you have to fit this mold, you have to fit this thing. And how do you change your entire culture to say, that's actually not what we're looking for? Mm-hmm. And so would love to just hear your thoughts on, like, as you heard the stories, first, were there any that like kind of stood out to you as like, wow, obviously I don't want you to share anything that is not, that's confidential, mm-hmm. but anything that stood out for you as you heard the stories?
Yeah. No, and I think you raise a good point, and one that I just want to, that I think a lot about, and that I feel really intentional and passionate about this, and that yes, I do think that pick a company and there is a mold. Mm-hmm. And maybe that mold is a big mold and maybe it's a really narrow mold, but there's a mold. I mean, it's like asking people to define professionalism, right? Could I go to work in pajamas? Literally, could I show up in pajamas, right? So there's some level of professionalism or decorum that we have agreed upon, but who decides that? Right. And I think that's why in my research, I've not wanted to interview people about how they've navigated the workplace. I think that's incredibly important, but I think it sends the wrong message, because I think the message is sometimes gets received as, if you speak up more in meetings, if you're more assertive, if you do these 10 things, then people will begin to respect you and you'll fit in better in the workplace. But I really wanted to get to the gatekeepers of the workplace, the gatekeepers of the culture. Who are those folks with formal and informal power? And I think in this case, these DEI leaders have a lot of informal power. They're providing, collectively, their work is providing reports directly to CEOs of major corporations. They're providing data analysis of HR. They're doing a lot of things that are creating visibility about gaps in their organizations to very senior leaders. So then what does that look like as you begin to, you know, use that power to really break down the culture? Now the hope is in everybody, and I say everybody, but and also in this case we're talking really specifically about race, but that people of color can show up to work how they show up to work, and that we're not going to put people in these molds. And yeah, we might have a couple of rules around, you know, I don't know, dress, I don't know, pick something, but it's not around our personalities. It's not around our lived experience. It's not around, you know, those things that research time and time again actually shows don't impact if somebody's successful in the workplace. And so I think that a lot of people talked about how they did that, how they were in rooms with CEOs, and how they, I think of one story. There was a person who worked for a major sports organization, identified it as female, and would talk a lot about, I am the only woman in any given room at any given time. And so she was put in charge of DEI because that's usually what happens. You're the one of this. So, hey, go lead everybody else who's a one of another identity group. And had a moment where somebody said, hey, I get that you're a woman, and race is a huge issue in this organization. Racism, not race, racism is a huge issue. And I think that she spent months meeting with people, unpacking her own stuff, figuring out like, oh, how can I, as a white woman, show up in meetings? And I mean, she was with the head of the organization and spoke out in a big meeting around like, we're not doing enough, and here's why, and here's the data to back it up. And for her, it was a very scary moment. And I think in that moment, she'll talk about how she didn't mind if she lost her job. She didn't mind, not that these things wouldn't be hard, but that statistically she would be okay. I think, you know, and I think that she felt what she had to say was more important and had to be said in that moment, and it was worth risking her reputation for. And in the end, in this case, it was positive, but people told stories where that was not positive. When they were told that they needed to be quiet, when they were told, don't do that again and don't bring that up again, where they were told they were flat out wrong. Like, the data isn't right, you know, what you're saying is wrong. And I think that individuals have had to really navigate that. And I think that those are the stories that really weigh on my mind, because how does an individual, how do I get there? How do I get to a point where I am speaking out and it doesn't necessarily feel like a risk for me, even though the risk is huge? On the outside, my job, my livelihood, or whatever these things are. But in that moment, it's like, man, that is so secondary to human beings, to the humanity of people. And I think a lot about that, and how people shared those stories, how they got where they were to that space. And most of them shared a story along those lines.
Which, like, it is so fascinating. And that's the thing that I've said, and, you know, and I do not say this flippantly at all, but it is I know there are certain things I can say in a room that Jackie cannot, or I know there are things that I can't say in a room that a white man could. And so I think that's that piece of, to your point, the story that you just referenced, like the person knew my job is going to still be safe. Whereas if, you know, my counterpart that maybe is a person of color, it is going to be seen as, oh, it's just that, you know, so-and-so stirring the pot again, or, you know, whatever. And you do have those moments of just like, who can say this, and why can certain people say it and certain people can't? And that again goes back to just the overall, to your point earlier, of who are those gatekeepers? Who are the folks that are kind of writing those unwritten rules, and, you know, defining those things in the culture of what is okay, what is not okay. And it is so fascinating to hear, you know, just that, you know, these folks, you know, definitely share some very similar stories to ones that I've heard from my, you know, counterparts that are people of color. And again, you know, I said this before we started recording. A lot of times I like to bring folks in when I'm going and working with a client. I'll bring some of my peers in that have different lived experiences, and it's very intentional and very purposeful because I want folks to hear other stories, because again, I don't have the lived experience and I'm not going to pretend that I do. And I think those are just so helpful, and and to keep them safe, but also to make sure that the right people are in the room, the leaders, the executives are in the room to hear these stories, because it does sometimes come down to, oh, that data can't be right. Oh, that data can't be true. And you're like, well, I don't think anyone was making stuff up. Like, these are real stories.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. So like, as you think about the research and like, what is next to, like, you know, where do you take this research next?
Yeah. So I think that we thought about a couple of different things because this was very isolated. We found ourselves very curious how this manifests in a team environment.
Mm.
So almost everybody in one way or another talked about the harm that they know they cause to their BIPOC friends, employees in their learning.
Mm-hmm.
And whether that be literally asking somebody, hey, what does this mean?
Mm-hmm.
Or having people who love you enough to provide feedback to you. Both of those things can be a lot of work for our
Mm-hmm.
friends of color. And so I think that we were curious on a team like DEI, what does learning look like in that space? And I mean, we can assume that there's undue burden on colleagues of color, and we would love to know, like, what can be done to alleviate that. I mean, the burnout rate of a chief diversity officer is incredibly high. It's outrageous. I think the average tenure is something like 2.5 years, or something really small. And the pay of all C-suite jobs, that one is substantially less than any other C-suite job across the board. And so we wonder, like, could there be some learnings of how teams work together to alleviate some of that extra work, some of that burden? How can that be built in a different way? So I think that that's one thing that we are curious. And I, as a white researcher, I try to be cautious about how I move forward with interviewing people of color or communities of color. I don't ever want this to feel like I'm looking in at communities. And so that would be led by another researcher, probably Dr. Cisco. And I would absolutely be happy to help behind the scenes. And I think as a research team, we talk about that a lot. Like, what is our role? How does our own race identity and our own lived experience impact what we decide to do next? But I think that team dynamic was something that we thought was really fascinating. We also thought it could be interesting to really get to, I think that we found interviews with cisgender straight men interesting, and there were a number of them. I know at one point we're like, oh, we don't have any, and then we opened it up and it wound up being about 20% of our data set, because I think that could also help unlock how can we provide these experiences in workplaces that inspire, engage, encourage. I'm not even quite sure what the right word is, to be quite honest with you, individuals to begin caring about their other humans around them, humanity. What does that look like in a workplace environment. So I think those are the two things that we've been kind of kicking the rock around on, trying to see how we're going to do that.
I think, both of those directions are so good. And the piece that I keep coming back to as you're talking is just it's not about changing the people who are in those marginalized groups, because that has always been kind of the historical, go-to as they, assimilate into whatever the culture is, and that shift that we're trying to have, but also honoring the experiences that people of color have had in these environments. And I'm saying people of color, but we could really, sub in any number of diversity dimensions. But the experiences where it was, and I think this was years ago, I went to a SHRM conference, and it was a D&I conference for SHRM, and one of the speakers was talking about the fact that he was a white male, gay, married, had children. And he was talking about the fact that when I first started working, before I came out, I had to switch like if someone said, hey, so what'd you do this weekend? Switching pronouns so that it was, and you could never say my partner. It was, he had to say my wife and I, did this, this, and this. And he's like, the burden of always having to think about that, not being able to hang a picture of my family up, not being able, and those are things that we have moved away from in so many places. But there are still those places where it's still not safe for folks to share, hey, yeah, I'm part of the LGBTQ community, or hey, I'm, maybe I present white, but I am a part of whatever group. And just some of these things that you don't understand the burden of until you do start to hear some of these stories and these experiences. And as you said, I have a dear friend, Joe Gerstad, who is a white male that does this work, and he's in Nebraska, and he talks about the fact, like, it's awkward sometimes, but I show up on that stage and I'm talking about, hey, other white men, here's what we need to do. And I think that's some of the part that, some of the pieces that are just so interesting is it's not oh, hey, how do we get the people of color or the people from those marginalized groups to do a certain thing or act a certain way? It's how do we change that majority? How do we change the majority to say, this is actually the way it should be working? And we just had a Dr. Roxy Manning, who is phenomenal. She was just on an episode which will air in a couple of weeks, and she was talking about the global majority and the fact that it's not white people. When you talk about the global majority,
by far, yes.
Yeah, and you think about that, and I think for so many folks, especially in the U.S., who are very US centric in their way of thinking, it is oh no, we are the majority group. And it's like, not even a little bit, like not even close. So yeah. I know I'm jumping around in a lot of places, but it is just so fascinating to see, how this all plays out. And I'm excited to see, this research already, I think, is just such a great starting point and such a great place for folks that are wanting to get into DEI and maybe don't know where to start, because I think all of the roles that you're talking about, all those personas, are ones that every single person could take on. And, like you said, Dr. Kendi talks about, like, there are moments that you're going to be the ally. There's others that you're going to be, in whatever position and, whatever role. And how do you act in those right ways or do the right things in those certain circumstances to advance the conversation?
Hey friends, Marnie Robbins here, host of Vibe Makers, a podcast now on the Work Defined Network. Look, we all know workplace culture doesn't come from a slide deck. Gross. It comes from people. So on Vibe Makers, I talk to the folks shaping the experience of work from the inside out. The HR and people ops folk, founders, leaders, and misfits building culture through small bets, big beliefs, and a whole lot of trial and error. No fluff. Well, maybe a little fluff, but mainly just candid talk about what happens when you stop duct taping your culture together. Come check us out. Listen to Vibe Makers wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I think it's so fascinating. And, I think one thing that's been interesting being in academics is to be able to see a little bit behind the curtain of like, why or like when I see students who are majoring in business administration and I think about all the theories and all, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? We get that in HR as well.
Mhm.
And begin to really unpack these almost sacred cows that we have in the workplace. Like, this is the right way to have an organization. This is the right way to do a strategy.
Mhm.
And I like to think that there is a pretty big group of people who are pushing back and saying that's incredibly westernized. And
Uh-huh.
I mean, if I were to just go to and ask my colleagues, like, tell me who you think the three most important management theorists are in your field, I feel fairly confident that off the top of their head that they would be white, perhaps European, depending on the time frame, men.
Right.
And so I think academics is really pushing that, and I'm hoping that begins to be another lever that we start pulling in workplaces where we can say, hey, actually, there is another way to do it, and this is what it is, and here's the research to back it up. But the hard, hairy thing with academics is it takes so long, and it's like, come on, let's get it on. Let's get this figured out, right? And so yeah, I think you're right on with that. And so I refuse to tell people, here's what you're doing wrong, and if you just did this, work would be easier, because I don't actually believe that's true.
Yeah.
I think then there would be another thing that person's not doing right, because if the culture, if that direct leader has biases that they have not acknowledged,
Right.
worked on, even acknowledging isn't even always enough, like, that person will continue to hit roadblocks that are no fault of their own.
Right. And I would agree with you. I mean, I just, as you asked that question, I was thinking, like, who would I mention, or who would I think of? And, obviously for HR, it's, Dave Ulrich, of course, is the godfather on our end. But then you think about, some of the older white men who, ran some of these large corporations and still are very influential in, how people work and how people think about work. I recently reread a book called Culture Map.
I haven't read that.
Sorry, I'm sitting in my bed to record, and of course now I'm like,
no worries, I get it. I get it. No problem.
No, let me lay down for a minute.
Yeah, I love it.
But it's, it talks about some of these factors of how do you start to think about interacting with different cultures and different groups, and who's right and who's wrong. And it's a great book. But I want to ask you, because you're talking about academia, and obviously that's kind of been a hot topic recently in the world of DEI, is some of the legislation that has occurred around I'm going to say, like, anti-CRT, but that's not even the right word, anti-DEI conversations or anti-culture conversations in academia. Would love just your thoughts and kind of what you're hearing from your side of the fence.
Yeah, I think that it is, it's interesting. It's interesting how many people are talking about critical race theory, where, like, 5 years ago, I don't think hardly anybody could have defined it unless you were in academics.
Right.
And I think CRT has really become the new word for Black or marginalized communities or BIPOC or sub in whatever movement somebody's DEI fighting against. And what's interesting is I think what we're seeing happening is actually just reinforcing the validity of what critical race theory is, because all of the parts of critical race theory we're seeing them, right? Like, we're seeing it's an everyday occurrence. We're seeing it's not a one-off. It's not an accident. That it's the air we breathe. Until those in dominant culture see themselves as part of the solution, we will remain in the space that we're in. Those are really critical things that Bell talks about with critical race theory. Simultaneously, I think that what I see is, and I'm in a management school, I'm also in a state right now today that doesn't have that legislation. And I preface that because I think it could be any one of us at any time.
Yep.
And so I think that there is sometimes in the field that I'm in, there's this perceived safety. Like, of course, it's not going to hit business because we care about innovation and diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Like these are values of ours, but they haven't been. I think the folks that I see impacted the most when the most stress are folks that are in ethnic studies departments. Those folks that are visibly talking about race and racism.
Yep.
I think I can mask mine in under equity or inclusion or managing a workforce, pick a topic. It's not so easy when I'm talking about African American history. Like that's what I'm talking about. And also most professors in that field identify as a person of color. And so I think that I have seen a lot of stress from my colleagues in that area. And what they've said, because again, not my lived experience, so I want to be really sensitive to that. They've said also, this is not the first time this has happened. Like, this is pretty ongoing. Perhaps it's a different word, it's a different thing, but in some way, anti-racism work has always been under attack, budget-wise, legislatively, from dominant culture. And so I've really been trying to follow the leaders in the anti-racism space to say, okay, how do I pivot? How do I support differently? What does that look like truly in a really pragmatic way in my work, in my research? Who am I working with? What does this look like? So I think it'll be an interesting year in higher ed. We'll continue to see more of this.
Yeah.
Is my guess. My guess. I have no knowledge. At least for another year.
Right.
I mean, till after the presidential election, at least, if not longer, depending who wins.
Right. Okay.
Yeah,
I think that's it's so fascinating to me, and so the University of Southern Florida actually put out a training, and it was like a certificate program around DEI and onboarding folks to being DEI consultants or within their workplace, running ERGs, whatever it might be. And I was looking for the coursework the other day to share it with someone. I was like, oh, it's gone. And I was like, okay, and it might, and I'm gonna say it might be that I just could not find it, so I'm gonna try and say that, but it was one of those like, oh wait, they're in Florida, so it very well could be it's done, and that's the part also that I think there's so much good stuff that folks have built and are trying to get out there to the masses. And it's unfortunate that it's being wrapped into this, woke, anti-woke conversation that's so like, the word still cracks me up because it is so you don't want to be woke, meaning you don't want to know anything that's going on. Okay, makes sense, totally. Anyways,
it's this really coded language, right? And I'll tell you, in class, I spend because I think I spend so much time with students truly asking them, what do you mean when you say that?
Yes.
Like, what do you like? Because I think that there's this idea that we all kind of know, and it isn't until we really start talking about what do you mean by woke or anti-woke, or like, what is that? What is it based in? What's the historical context for it? And I don't know. I just always hope that it's something that they'll reflect on, because a lot of times I'm like, I don't know what we're talking about anymore because I'm hearing the words, but they're being used in a completely different context. And so I feel it's like, is this a dog whistle right now? Or are we really talking about, I don't know. So I do think that, these words get used interchangeably for things and can in many times be a dog whistle. And so it's trying to figure out what that is.
Yeah. And I think that's such a critical piece of advice of asking the question, what do you mean by that? And that's something that I think with all of these topics, just digging in when someone is talking about something, just, hey, tell me more about that. Why do you think that way? What do you think that means? That type of thing, because I think that slows people down enough that they start to think about the language that they're using. And once you start digging in and they go, oh, well, that's not what I meant, then you have a different conversation, a different kind of educational conversation.
Agreed.
So, which is great. So Becky, I know I have taken way more of your time, but I want to just ask one question of you. Like, what is one thing, or what is one or two things, what are one or two things that you would like for our audience to have heard from this conversation?
Yeah, so I think one, thank you for the work that you're doing and that you continue to do, you and everybody who's listening. I think that this is the work of love, and it's not always easy. And so thank you. I think it really matters. The other thing that I think a lot of folks came to, and there's this podcast, if anybody is interested in, called The Modern White Man with Ken Lawrence and Paul Johnson. And they talk a lot about whiteness and what does it mean to be white. And one thing I think that I was listening, and it was this idea that I'm never going to be perfect. And I know that that sounds really like, of course you're not, right? Like, duh. But I spend a lot of time trying to be perfect, to say the right things in this work, to come across as smart, to come across as a good friend and an ally, and that I'm disrupting in the absolute best way possible. And so if I were to have anybody just like go, what can I work on today? It would be doing the work of getting comfortable with imperfection. And that could be going to therapy. That could be reading Brene Brown's Gifts of Imperfection. That could be talking to your loved ones, right? They're probably going to be quickly, I tell you what parts you're not perfect at, but I think sitting in that space and being human in this work is incredibly important. And I'm learning that lesson all the time, but the more human I become, I actually find myself engaging much more, because I'm less concerned with the presentation of something, and I'm more concerned with doing the right thing, or whatever that thing is in the moment.
Right.
So I think that's the one takeaway. And I think that the folks that we interviewed went on that journey as well, for a really long journey, quite honestly, and are still going through it, myself included.
Awesome. Yeah. And I would add, for folks that are listening to this episode, I think the pieces that all of it resonated, and there were so many good points that you made, but I think the pieces that I would call out to folks are just that this is a journey, and we're all on our own journey. And so whatever you're taking, whatever learning you're doing, whatever you're trying to do to kind of bring that, bring more information to yourself, to your teams, to your organizations, just realize everyone's going to be at a different place in their journey, but also realizing that we just have to keep plowing ahead. And Jackie and I have talked about, we're hopeful that we're getting to a place where soon we won't have to talk about some of the stuff, but it's just that, like, we're at, hey, it's going to get worse before it's going to get better kind of a situation. And hopefully that is the case. And, to your point, some of the political things that will be going on here in the next year or two might change some of the conversation. But, I'm hopeful that folks can listen to this and read your research, because it was just amazing, and really just dig in on how do we do this the right way. And I think, this isn't research that should just be read by white people doing this work. I think everyone can benefit from it. But really looking at this perspective of, as white people, how do we show up? How do we do this the right way? And how can we learn from the mistakes of others, but also, as you said, be okay with making mistakes ourselves, and keep trying. So thank you so much for joining us. We are going to have an episode 2 when Jackie can join us. I know she's super bummed she couldn't make it today, but we'll have her on for a future episode, Becky, so that you can chat more with us. But thank you so much for taking the time today.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah. And anybody can reach out. I'd love to talk about this stuff. Even if you disagree with me, I'd love to hear from you. I promise. I think it's great. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Becky is on LinkedIn. You can find her. Like I said, I'll put a link for her research in our show notes. And yeah, reach out if you have any questions at all. But thank you for taking the time. This is Katee Van Horn, and this is the Inclusive AF podcast. Bye-bye.